They say your brain plays tricks on you when you cross a century. Pause. But I can still feel the exact temperature of the silver ring pressing into the skin of my knuckles. I can still smell the mixture of sweat and expensive cologne. My name is Eleanor. I am 103 years old. For nearly 50 years, I watched the documentaries, I saw the magazine covers, and I stayed completely silent. I never told my husband. I never told my children. Voice cracked slightly. Because if I spoke the words out loud, I was terrified the memory would evaporate like cheap perfume. But I don't have much time left, and I need someone to know what happened in the dark of that arena in the winter of 1975. Here is the revised English version of Chapter 1, keeping the visceral and melancholic tone exactly as requested, but without any bracketed pause or breathing markers. In 1975, I was 52 and completely invisible. People's eyes slid right off me on the sidewalk like dirty water on glass. I worked the graveyard shift at an industrial laundry facility. My world permanently smelled of chemical bleach and ammonia. My hands were always cracked, my cuticles bleeding from the biting Detroit cold, and my lower spine carried a dull ache that throbbed in the exact rhythm of my heartbeat. My husband had passed away 7 years prior. My house was so absurdly quiet that the dripping of the kitchen sink echoed against the empty walls. To sleep I wore his old flannel shirts because the frayed cuffs still held the bitter scent of his shaving lotion. I was just waiting for my end, letting the calendar pages turn yellow. My only companion was a battered wooden radio on the counter. I didn't listen to the music. I just needed the hum of static and human voices to fill the dark of my living room. I was absolutely certain my story was already carved in stone. But I had no idea that on one freezing Tuesday, that grease-stained radio would speak a name that would tear my gray little world wide open. I was scrubbing a burnt cast-iron skillet when I heard it. Suspicious minds. I dropped the steel wool. The soapy water overflowed onto the linoleum, soaking through my thin cotton slippers, but I didn't care. It wasn't just his voice, it was the raw, bleeding desperation behind it. He sounded like a man pleading for his very survival. I wiped my stinging hands on my apron, walked straight over to that greasy radio, and pressed my forehead against the warm wooden speaker grill. It woke something violent and forgotten inside my chest. The next morning, I walked into a brightly lit record store on Woodward Avenue. The teenagers in their bell-bottoms stared at me, but I marched to the counter and bought the vinyl. When the local station announced he was bringing his tour to the Pontiac Silverdome, I lost my mind. The ticket cost $45. That was my entire grocery and heating budget for 3 straight weeks. I didn't care if I starved in the dark. I walked to the box office in the biting wind and bought a single ticket for the floor section, row 4. I took it home, wrapped it in plastic, and hid it deep inside my flour jar. Every night I would dig it out, brush the white powder off the stiff cardboard, and trace the printed letters of his name with my bruised thumb. I honestly thought the hardest part was over. I had my golden ticket, but I didn't know the winter sky was about to play a cruel, desperate trick on me just hours before the show. December 31st, 1975, the afternoon of the show. I woke up to the sound of freezing rain lashing against my bedroom window. A massive winter storm had turned the Detroit streets into sheets of black ice. I grabbed my keys, but my rusty Plymouth wouldn't turn over. The engine just clicked and died. I sat behind the freezing steering wheel and pounded my fists against the dashboard until my knuckles bruised. The buses had stopped running. The arena was 4 miles away. I looked at my thin leather loafers, wrapped a plastic bag over my wet hair, and started walking. The wind cut through my wool coat like razor blades. I slipped on the asphalt, tearing the knee of my only good slacks, tasting copper blood where I bit my lip to keep from crying out loud. By the time the concrete dome loomed in the dark, my jaw ached from shivering. I dragged myself to the entrance, pulled my frozen hand from my pocket to show the security guard my golden ticket, and my stomach dropped. My pocket was entirely empty. I patted my wet coat, frantic, sobbing, tearing at my own clothes in front of staring strangers. Standing outside those arena doors with absolutely nothing, I was ready to just lay down in the snow and let the cold take me, until a heavy hand fell on my shoulder. It was a young usher in a red jacket. He didn't say a single word. He just looked at my bloody knee, my soaked, freezing hair, and my trembling blue lips. He reached out, unhooked the velvet rope, and pushed me gently inside the warm lobby. The heat hit my face like a physical blow, but it wasn't just the temperature that knocked the wind out of me. It was the raw, electric violence in the air. I pushed my way through the heavy arena doors, and the sheer volume of 60,000 screaming people almost threw me backward. The smell was suffocating and intoxicating all at once. Spilled draft beer drying on concrete, stale cigarette smoke, heavy clouds of cheap cologne, and the sharp, metallic scent of thousands of flashbulbs popping in the dark. I didn't have my cardboard ticket anymore, but I knew exactly where I belonged. Row 4. I used my sharp elbows like weapons, shoving past angry men and annoyed women. I was bruised, dripping wet mud onto the floor and violently shivering, but I squeezed my way to the very front. I pressed my aching ribs against the cold steel barricade just as the brass section blared to life. The stadium lights cut out to pure black. I was staring up at the empty microphone stand, completely unaware that in just a few minutes he wouldn't be singing to the crowd anymore. He would be looking directly at me. He walked out. The heavy gold embroidery on his white jumpsuit caught the blinding spotlight. I couldn't even hear myself screaming because 60,000 voices were tearing through the air around me. He started singing the slow chords of Love Me Tender. He walked right to the edge of the stage, sweating heavily, a pale blue silk scarf hanging loose around his neck. He was smiling at the young girls crying in the front row. And then his eyes shifted. He saw me. I looked completely absurd. A 52-year-old woman, soaked to the bone, mud drying on my cheek, shivering while the rest of the world cheered. He stopped walking. The band kept playing, but he just stood there, staring down into my tired eyes. He knelt down. The heavy, musky smell of his cologne washed over me. He reached his hand out. My arms were paralyzed. He smiled a lopsided smile and grabbed my icy, calloused, bleach-stained fingers. His skin was burning hot. He pulled gently, and the security guards lifted me over the steel barricade. Suddenly, my wet, ruined loafers were standing on the carpeted stage. He pulled me flat against his chest. I felt the heavy metal studs of his suit pressing hard into my collarbone. We swayed, right there, in front of a roaring stadium. We just swayed. As he finally let go of my trembling hand, he leaned his head down, putting his lips right against my ear, and whispered a secret that would completely alter the remaining 50 years of my life. Gemini Dijo, you ain't invisible, mama. You're the prettiest thing in this room. The heavy bass vibrated through my ribs as the security guards gently guided me down the carpeted stairs. The rest of the show was a blinding blur of white spotlights. When the stadium finally emptied, leaving behind a massive concrete floor covered in crushed cups and torn ticket stubs, I walked the 4 miles back home. The ice storm had passed. The yellow streetlights reflected perfectly in the black puddles on the asphalt. It was dead silent. My ears were ringing with a sharp whine from the amplifiers, but I wasn't shivering anymore. I walked with my back entirely straight. I looked up at the frozen bare branches of the oak trees, pulling the freezing night air deep into my lungs, and for the first time in a decade, my chest didn't feel heavy. I walked into my dark, empty house, and the dripping sink didn't sound like a judge's gavel anymore. It just sounded like water. He looked at a forgotten widow and gave me my life back in 10 seconds. That night completely changed how I walked and how I breathed. But there is exactly one physical piece of that night I managed to keep, and it is resting right here on my lap. Gemini dijo, I am 103 years old now. My eyes are milky, my knees refuse to bend, and most mornings I can't even remember the taste of the coffee I just drank. But when I run my crooked, trembling thumb over the frayed edge of this pale blue silk scarf resting on my lap, my chest tightens. I am 52 again. I am standing in the blinding, suffocating heat of a stadium spotlight. I spent so much of my life terrified of getting older. I was terrified of fading into the beige wallpaper, of becoming an invisible ghost while my lungs were still drawing breath. But I learned the hard way that my soul didn't actually age a single day. It just sat quietly in the dark. It waited for someone to look at me, to truly, deeply look at me, and remind me that my blood was still pumping. He is gone. My husband is gone. My entire era is buried in the frozen ground. But this faded piece of silk still smells faintly of heavy sweat and expensive cologne, and as long as my fingers can hold it, I am still the prettiest thing in the room.